Morning, Jim.
Yeah, morning, Greg.
Nice to actually have a chat with you for the first time, I think.
Yes, I think, it's nice to meet you.
What a time to do it. Russia potentially, almost a coup we thought was going to happen on the weekend, but these mercenary groups are not happy with Mr Putin at the moment.
No, Greg. Mr Putin's at pains to sort of reassert his authority. Mm-hmm. The Wagner group, under the control of Yevgeny Prigozhin, is also adamant it's not a coup, it was a protest.
Okay.
He was unhappy with the way in which certain military leaders were conducting the war in Ukraine. Allegedly, the city which he took over, his troops were being bombed accidentally, deliberately. That was his rationale for taking over the city of Rostov-on-Don and for basically laying down an ultimatum to Putin and the government that this has got to stop. The generals have got to actually get their act together, and they've got to. The other dimension, was that they were also planning to incorporate the Wagner group as a mercenary group into the Russian army, as part of the Russian army, rather than as an independent military organisation that was independent of the Russian military. Now, Prigozhin was not wanting to let that happen because basically Wagner is a major corporate entity connected to the Russian state, but it has its own global reach, as it were. For US observers, this was seen as Russia, the Russian state, extending its influence globally. But it's hard to know exactly what the specific connection is between Wagner and the Russian government. Certainly it once had the support personally and politically of Putin and the government.
Yep.
Now, of course, it is very much at arm's length, and it remains to be seen whether Prigozhin survives in Belarus, whether his exile is a prelude to retaliation on the part of Putin. All of that speculation at the moment. Putin is seen as being weakened by this because it's basically made public the fracture lines within the Russian government. And there are other elites, other oligarchs, other powerful players who may see an opportunity to increase their particular control. What I find really interesting about this is, although mercenaries are supposedly banned by the United Nations,
there seems to be a lot of them.
They have grown exponentially since the 1990s, in particular with the end of the Cold War. And I think there were several million military personnel who had nowhere to go, in effect, and suddenly these companies start springing up as guns for hire, so to speak.
Yeah.
Now, the
security liaisons.
Yes, a whole range of things. And what starts out as a tame extension of state power, but independent of that power, so that the government of the day has plausible deniability, which is how some of the private military contractors operated in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the US government could hire them to deliver certain objectives.
Yep.
But if it all went wrong, they could step back.
Effectively wipe their hands from it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, in principle, governments think, well, this is a pretty good idea. We can exercise our authority, our military prowess, without actually putting our own military personnel at risk. Unfortunately, as these things unfold, and I say unfortunately for governments, but as these things unfold, these private military companies increase their power. So if we look at the Wagner Group, it's got operations in a number of countries in Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, etc. And while on the surface they might appear as extensions of the Russian state via the Wagner Group has more or less declared its independence of the Russian state, asserted its independence with this demonstration. And
America's concerned about that, aren't they?
Yes, they've got some worries about that as well. If we look at the Wagner Group again in a bit more detail, we see that it's not just simply a military concern, a mercenary group as such. It's got a whole range of other networks and commercial operations, including major public relations and media type networks that it is able to operate. And I was reading earlier this morning that one strategic analyst has described this as a PR, Wagner as a PR group with a military capability. That might be a bit of an exaggeration. But what it points to, what it suggests is that when governments outsource their military capacity, they basically set in motion the potential forces that they may lose control of. And what we've seen historically, if we look back in history, when mercenaries have been deployed by different states, have been used by different regimes to prop up their power, that almost invariably at some point the mercenaries turn on the organisation or the government that has
hired them in the first place.
Or they shift allegiances and team up with some other force within that country and overthrow the government. Now, it's unlikely that Prigozhin had the goal of overthrowing Putin. I think it was more a case of flexing some muscles and demonstrating to Putin that if we wanted to, we could cause some serious damage. But we didn't want to do that. We wanted to, basically draw your attention to the fact that A, some of your generals are incompetent. B, there's no way that our forces are going to be incorporated into the Russian army. And C, you need to take control of the political situation and keep your generals more accountable. Exactly how Putin's going to respond, his speech yesterday, Monday, was, shall we say, repressed or seething anger. And it's really hard to know, Greg, whether that anger was rhetorically generated to demonstrate to the Russian people that he's a deeply caring person about the Russian state, about Russia, and his anger is for the threat that this posed to Russia, or whether that anger was much more personal than somebody, directed at somebody whom he trusted, who was very close. I mean, Prigozhin was once described as the chef to Putin, and that Prigozhin had been very instrumental in a number of political manoeuvres that Putin was able to perform. So it's hard to know where that anger wells up from, but it's certainly the case that Putin is not happy with where things have gone, and yet we've seen this huge turnaround. On Saturday, these were traitors and criminals, and there was an arrest warrant issued for Prigozhin. By Monday, Prigozhin is allowed to go into exile. There's no arrest warrant anymore. The people are not criminals, and the Wagner mercenaries are free, if they choose, to follow Prigozhin to Belarus and go into exile, or they can join the Russian army and sign a contract with the Russian army. Exactly what will flow from that is hard to tell. And as I said...
It's hard to follow as well, to be honest.
Well, it is. And Russian politics has always been very complicated because and difficult to follow, partly because we don't see it as much on the surface. We see a very polished veneer, and underneath that veneer we're not quite sure what is really going on and who is wielding the power at this stage. But I think, the lessons for us to think about are really when private mercenary contractors or companies are allowed to grow unfettered, are allowed to operate, there's a risk to the regime that employs them. In a democratic society, it's a risk to the democracy. And in a totalitarian form of government, it's a risk to the shall we say, the clique at the top who are trying to exercise their power. Because once you unleash those forces, it's very difficult to control them because when the state has a monopoly of violence, which is how it's sort of we usually understand the political entity of the state, but when you deploy mercenaries within that state, they also are licensed to exercise violence, but they're not necessarily bound by the same rules that, say, bind the army and the police and the other agencies of the state that are authorised to exercise violence, within the legal framework of that state. Mercenaries, on the other hand, become a force unto themselves. And historically, when we look back over history, we see that regimes that don't keep a close eye on them find themselves crumbling underneath them.
Yep. The other thing with mercenaries as well, though, there's no loyalty to the state as well. It's someone else could chime in with a bit more cash and say, well,
exactly, Greg. It's they're guns for hire in effect, and they weigh up whether they're getting enough. They can be bought in effect. So they really look to the highest bidder. Very little ideological or cause-based activity. They're money-making organisations, and that's really the bottom line, unfortunately, that as guns for hire, they'll deliver violence to whoever rewards them the most richly.
Which is pretty a sad thing, really. It's
Well, it certainly is, and it's a sort of commentary on, I guess, the sort of global politics that's unfolded over the past 40 or 50 years. Once upon a time, mercenary groups were very much frowned upon. But around about the mid-60s, they began to emerge, a group here, a group there. I think the first one was in the UK, but I'd have to check the sort of history there. But they really exploded at the end of the Cold War. And governments have found it convenient to use them from time to time. But of course, when governments do things as a matter of expediency, they take a shortcut and they think this is a good move. It won't cost us much, and we can have a war without actually losing any of our own soldiers. That tends to backfire in the end. People change sides, as you say. Someone else offers them more gold, so they switch sides and turn their firepower back on the original hiring company.
Jim Jose, thank you very much. It's probably could talk about mercenaries all morning, really. But
Yes.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Greg.
2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.